One of the biggest challenges you will ever face in your life is to look above all the minor distractions of today and envision the bigger picture. Unfortunately, most people are so caught up in the minutiae of daily life that they neglect to ask the right questions. I hear a lot of questions from people wanting life to be easier or for more success. In my opinion, asking for ease or success is asking the wrong question. I think these questions are based off the idea that the most satisfying life is the one with the least troubles and the most results. I disagree. I would say the best life is the one that is the most interesting. As you approach your own end, the ease of your life or sustaining results won't matter nearly so much as how you lived the process. Here are 9 steps for taking a dull or mediocre existence and creating a life that is actually worth living. A life that is interesting. Step 1. Meet more people. One of the best ways to make your life more interesting is simply to have a larger social reference group. Each connection you make with another human being is like a small opening into their world. If that connection is valuable, then many of the interesting events, ideas and growth they experience can be shared with yourself. Some people who are poor at meeting new people justify this outlook with an elitist attitude. Other people are inferior in some way so as to justify not meeting them. Unfortunately, this attitude corrupts every relationship you form and you become stranded on a social island. I disagree with the psychological hypothesis that says our tendency towards meeting new people and forming relationships is fixed and unchangeable. I am incredibly outgoing today, but this wasn't always the case. I can remember times just a few years before where I had trouble sustaining more than a few friends. Now I know hundreds of people and have strong ties with a few dozen. Socializing is a skill that may come from birth but can certainly be learned through practice. Step 2. Take up new hobbies. Remember that activity you always wanted to try but never had time for. Do it now. Life won't wait for your schedule to clear up, so you need to take the initiative. I'm not saying you need to abandon all your duties, but you need to actively invest some of your time in trying new things. Don't stick to one hobby for too long either. Most hobbies are non-essential skills, so achieving a mastery level of them generally doesn't yield much more benefits than proficiency. If you love your hobby, stick with it, but it is important to keep trying new things to keep your life interesting. Not sure where to start? My personal advice for a hobby everyone could benefit from is to go stop by your local Toastmasters club. Communication is the key to life, and meetings are fun too. Besides, if you enjoy it, you might just complete steps 1 and 2 at the same time. You can find a club in your area. Step 3. Be spontaneous. I must say that my ability to be spontaneous was incredibly low until just recently. I was a big fan of having a fixed schedule and sticking to it. Only later did I realize that by sticking to a rigid schedule one missed as many opportunities as I capitalized on by using it. Spontaneity isn't a hard skill to learn. It is combining flexibility with discipline that is difficult. Successful flexibility comes from having a very strong inner sense of discipline. This is the ability to act upon opportunities knowing the costs associated. Without this inner discipline, it is too easy to waste time pursuing opportunities when demands are placed on you. Ironically, the key to practicing this discipline has to start with a fairly rigid approach to productivity. From this point, slowly act on more and more spontaneous opportunities, all while adhering to the things you need to do. Eventually, you should be able to recognize the costs associated with taking up an opportunity or not without requiring extreme rigidity. Step 4. Tackle fears. The ultimate enemy of an interesting life is fear. Boredom is just another symptom of fear because you are limiting yourself within a box of safe activities. When you build up your courage to taking down fears, your life suddenly becomes a lot more interesting, challenging, and most of all satisfying. Step 5. Do things you won't like. This may seem like a very bizarre step, but it is essential to creating an interesting life. Every once in a while you need to step outside your zone of preferred activities and test the waters of activities you dislike. You might be displeased, or you might just discover something you now enjoy. Many of the things I now love I once thought I would hate. Have no rhythm? Take some dancing lessons. Not an athlete? Join a community sports team. Everything you make in the kitchen starts on fire? Try some cooking lessons and pick up an extra fire extinguisher. Step 6. Add some spice. What's the spice of life? Variety, of course. If there is one thing you can do to create a more interesting life, it is to add more variety. Humans are habitual creatures and readily settle into patterns of behavior, good or bad. You need to mix up your life by breaking out of these patterns and doing something completely different. This may seem like a complete turnaround from someone who wrote an entire series on forming habits. I trust you it isn't. The amount of habits you consciously choose to install will be less than 1% of all the habits you use every day. Most of these habits are neutral or worse and could use a good shaking to add some variety. So take a different route to work next morning. Try a different breakfast or listen to a radio station you have never heard before. And that's just before you get to the job. There are endless ways to add tiny bits of variety, and while it might seem trivial, it is essential to make each day worthwhile and memorable. A friend of mine introduced me to an interesting challenge to add more variety. Next time you go to the grocery store, head over to the imported foods aisle and pick out one item you have never had before. Last week I had plantain chips and guava juice. Today I have grass jelly juice cooling in my fridge. Step 7. Orient purpose outside yourself. You want to know what it is the best way to feel awful and miserable all the time? Keep thinking about all your problems. Maybe it is time to stop worrying about that garbage and instead focus on helping other people solve their problems? Not only does this make others appreciate you more and strengthens relationships, but it makes your life more interesting as well. Many people wrongly assume that helping others is something you do purely out of altruism. This is incorrect. You help people because helping others helps yourself. Why do you think your body is hardwired to feel good after being charitable? Because being charitable helps you as well. It's win-win. Solving others' problems doesn't usually bear the negative weight that tackling your own does, so it is a great way to add interest to your life without the burden of more and more challenges. Even if it is as simple as trying to make people laugh or feel good. When you orient the purpose of every interaction outside yourself, you get to experience an interesting life. Step 8. Abandon dead ends. Pursuing goals is a great way to fill your life with more passion and interest, but there comes a time when your goals no longer inspire or hold the same fire they once did. Abandon any pursuit that no longer holds the value it did when you started. There is no honor in finishing something that has lost meaning. The person who said, "Always finish what you start," must have had a very boring life. I've made the mistake of giving up on goals because I felt they were too hard. This was a bad mistake, but I usually take up a new challenge when I grow restless. Unfortunately, a bigger mistake is to keep pursuing a goal that has lost value. I've done this and wasted solid months and years pursuing things that when I finally arrived at them resulted only in emptiness. Abandon a dead end and keep every moment interesting. Step 9. Never settle. When most people tell you not to settle, they mean don't give up until you have exactly what you want. Although this is an important lesson, I'm using the term settle in a different way. When I say don't settle, I mean don't lock your life into a set of behaviors and experiences. Your life should always be growing, expanding and fresh. Now I know what you're thinking. Sure, this is fine advice coming from a young man with no commitments, but I have a spouse, children and mortgage payments. Of course, we all have varying responsibilities which we need to uphold, but what you are really offering is just an excuse. You can grow and expand in any setting no matter the restrictions, so long as you have conscious power. Being in a situation with more responsibilities simply means you need to be more creative in keeping life fresh. Nobody will care that you wasted your life because you had to. If there isn't a way, make one. Don't excuse yourself out of a great life. Beyond introversion and extroversion. There are many ways to track personality from the ancient Greeks philosophers who thought that people tended to come in 4 varieties based on their emotionality and, of course, introversion to extroversion. Myers-Briggs personality tests are fairly popular today, using 4 different measurements of personality, with the first personality distinction being that between an introvert and extrovert. Of the myriad of other tests available for determining your personality type, virtually all of them include a scale between introversion and extroversion. I believe that the introversion and extroversion distinction is a completely useless measurement to use if you want to improve your own life. In fact, I feel strongly that many people have been unnecessarily locked inside a personality label which is inadequate in describing the complexity of human behavior. I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I have little scientific basis for arguing my claims aside from several books and many articles I have read on personality types. But I am not here to argue the scientific validity of the introversion to extroversion bias. Although I question the scientific merit of creating a linear scale to represent any form of behavior, this argument isn't about whether or not introversion and extroversion are unscientific labels. I speak from personal experience. My argument is going to focus on why introversion, extroversion labels are ridiculous to use in improving the quality of your life and how they form unnecessary limitations for you. I believe that not only is there more than one dimension between introversion and extroversion, but that you are free to consciously change your bias between these 2 extremes. Since I am arguing that you should abandon these 2 labels from a personal experience standpoint, I might as well share some of my personal experience. As a child and through most of my teenage years, I was incredibly introverted. I was shy and quiet in pretty much all social gatherings. I generally had 1 or 2 good friends as opposed to dozens, and I was far more comfortable being alone. Some personality tests I took during this time rated me as highly introverted. Like many other introverts, I was fairly dissatisfied with my label. Sure, I rationalized to myself that being an introvert was better than going off and having fun with other people. But social pressures along with my own dissatisfaction made me intensely unhappy about being an introvert. Several years ago I started questioning this introversion label that had been applied to me. Perhaps, I thought, this label was no more than an illusion that was locking myself into behaviors that made me more and more introverted. Perhaps, I thought, I could change this direction and choose who I wanted to be. Working hard, I slowly brought up my communication skills. I worked hard to improve my social skills, particularly in the group settings that I had found so uncomfortable before. I also worked to increase my tolerance to the stimulation provided by these settings. Sure, it was very draining to be around so many people at first, but as I worked at it I got used to the extra input. I joined Toastmasters and worked on my public speaking. Flash forward to the present and I could consider myself highly extroverted. Easily handling group situations, I have met and made friends with dozens of people in the few short days since my move to university. I have little problem speaking in public and I am good at meeting new people. Today I feel no energy drain being around people. Quite the opposite, it actually charges me. For a child who was labeled extremely introverted, I have made quite a turnaround. Now that you can see my own personal experience, I'd like to share why I believe that introversion and extroversion labels are complete junk from a personal growth standpoint on 3 different premises. The first premise that I want to argue that the introversion, extroversion labels are useless is when we look at introversion and extroversion as skills. One of the ways personality tests judge your current introversion and extroversion bias is in communication and social skills. If you get nervous speaking in public, one of the reasons is likely that you haven't mastered the skills necessary to perform well. Since you can't perform well without the proper skills, you will likely feel nervous. More than just communication skills and nervousness, skills come in the form of experience with social situations. If you speak in front of a crowd of several thousand people and you have never done it before, you lack the proper skills to handle yourself in front of such a large audience. If, however, you have spoken to crowds this size many times before and some even larger, then a crowd of several thousand probably won't scare you. You have acquired the skills necessary to perform in this environment. Just like baseball, drawing or riding a bicycle, social skills can be learned and improved. You know in your own life areas where you lacked skills that you now have. Using skills as a measure of your introversion and extroversion puts these 2 labels on very shaky grounds. If by improving a few skills you can become more extroverted or introverted, then using these labels as permanent indicators of your personality would be like labeling people in categories of bicycle riders and non-bicycle riders. The other distinction I hear very often between introverts and extroverts is that introverts are more easily stimulated by events whereas extroverts require much larger doses of stimulation to feel the same sensations. Since too much and too little stimulation generally results in uncomfortable emotions, introverts, it is said, tend to avoid stimulation and extroverts crave it. I don't disagree with this concept of stimulus response. Those who are currently introverted are likely to avoid stimulation because their body reacts to it more severely. However, This concept doesn't exclude the ability for you to consciously condition your body to handle more or less stimulus. Our bodies are incredible machines at adapting. With virtually any body function, when there is an appropriate environmental change, the body adapts to compensate. Why wouldn't the bias between introversion and extroversion also be subject to this effect? Shouldn't exposing yourself to more and more stimulus make you less sensitive to it? Conversely, wouldn't exposing yourself to less stimulus make you more sensitive? Even though it is initially uncomfortable, you can slowly build up your tolerance to stimulation if you are currently very introverted. By conditioning the body to handle increasingly more stimulating environments, you can get more and more extroverted. If you are currently very extroverted, conditioning yourself to reduce stimulation may be helpful if you want to pursue things that require a more solitary focus. Above all of my arguments for the abandonment of these two labels for human personality, the most important one is this. Labels for introversion and extroversion create a self-fulfilling prophecy that continuously reinforce themselves. In other words, the belief that you are an introvert will color your perceptions and ultimately your ability to change it. The identities we create for ourselves form our own self-fulfilling prophecies. To an incredibly large extent, you are whatever you think you are. If you think of yourself as being incredibly successful and talented, that is quite often the reality you create for yourself. The person who sees themselves as being weak and feeble will craft themselves in exactly that same image. This incredibly powerful principle of identity couldn't be stronger in the matters of introversion and extroversion. Believe you are an introvert and you cut off any personality traits that contradict this. Once you are given a label or an identity, it is very easy to find evidence supporting this. If you were to look around, couldn't you find some strong evidence to show that the world is in dire straits, getting worse and worse every day? Of course you could. Just look at all the horrible stuff that is happening right now. But couldn't you also look around and see all the things that indicate things are getting better? So if you are told that you are an introvert, you will immediately search your environment for supporting evidence. Any contradictory references will be filtered out in order to fit into the label of introvert. By abandoning the labels of introvert and extrovert as being your preset personality, and exploring the idea that you have power over how you want to interact with the world, you can create that power. Introversion and extroversion may be useful to psychologists sitting in ivory towers trying to explain the patterns of behavior they see, but it isn't useful in maximizing your own life.